Hello. Slightly loud. Is this better? Yes. All right. Brilliant. If you are here for our Radical Histories panel, do come on down and grab a seat. We're going to start in a few minutes. If you are browsing the fair during this event, enjoy the books. Feel free to stick around. We just ask that you don't chat too loudly and just be aware that the audience in here is watching and you're all sharing a space. Good morning. Afternoon. It is afternoon. I think this microphone might also need to be slightly louder. But also I'm going to ask anyone who's browsing in the room if you can keep chat to a minimum during the event, just so that people over here, yes, don't have too much chatter over. It's not hushing as much, is it? Rachel, hi love. Could we do a wee whip round of the room to just remind people that we're going to hush for the event? Thank you. My name is Myri. I run Lighthouse, Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop, and we are your host for the Radical Book Fair. Our host for this particular panel is the wonderful Ali Heather. I'm going to introduce him, and then he's going to introduce our speakers. Anyone who's watching online, let us know if you have any issues with the sound, and you'll be able to ask your questions online, and you'll be able to ask your questions too. Ali Heather has produced documentaries on subjects such as Scottish culture, the Scots language, and male violence against women. He writes regularly for the press and presents programs such as the award-winning Natrads music show on BBC Alba and BBC Scotland's Burns Night show. He has a successful history Instagram page exploring stories from around Scotland, which is definitely worth checking out. Will you put your hands together to welcome Ali Heather and our panel for our Radical Histories?
Good afternoon. Are we ready to applause for our three speakers? Right, if you go cozy. Go here. Yeah, that's you there. You're going to get really cozy on that couch, I think.
These will be warm.
Well, hello everyone, good afternoon, and you're very, very welcome to this fascinating book talk. We have three brilliant authors who've produced work of real merit that's full of challenging ideas, really enjoyable anecdotes, and discussions of phenomena from various perspectives. I thought what we'd do today is go through each author in turn, let them tell you basically what's in their book, share some of the stories from it, share some of the arguments they're putting forward, and then we'll have a more generalized panel discussion. And then at 1:45, we'll get some, after 45 minutes, we'll get some great questions from yourselves to keep the discussion going. I'm Alistair Heather, by the way. I'm a writer and presenter and did my undergraduate and master's in history. So that's my interest in being here today. If we can start with yourself, June, this is your beautiful book here, A Place of Our Own. When I first picked it up, it was a lot of homework for this, by the way, 3 whole books to read. But when I first picked it up, I got such an excitement from maybe the first or second page in the introduction, because it says this book is going to explore 6 queer spaces that lesbians have made for themselves. And the first couple are quite obvious. The lesbian bar, sure, we all know that kind of space. The feminist bookstore, absolutely. But then the softball diamond as like a queer space, like that's brand new to me, and sort of lesbian land colonization of the 1970s and this kind of stuff. It was such an eye-opener. It was such an enjoyable read. Can you tell us a little bit about the content, and then we can talk about why you came to write it?
Yeah, I think the kind of the starting point for the book was something that felt very clear to me when I came out, which was that I was going to be in a different kind of space from the people I grew up around. I knew that if I wanted to find partners, friends, collaborators, political partners, I would need to go somewhere different. And, yes, there was the bar. That was kind of the obvious one. But as I say in the book, lesbians, queer people generally don't have a homeland. There's no place in the world we are a natural majority. And when we're growing up, our families very, very rarely have any sense of queer culture. They might not know that such a thing exists. They might even resist that notion. And so we have to go find it for ourselves. And so, this is something that people have been doing for decades, as long as there have been queer people, which is, of course, forever. My book talks about the US starting in around the 1970s. And the thing that became obvious was that if women wanted to have places where they could get together, they would have to start them. One of the things that researching the 6 chapters, and I should just say quickly that they are indeed the lesbian bar, the feminist bookstore, the softball diamond, lesbian land, the feminist sex toy boutique, and queer vacation destinations.
I was too shy to mention the sex toy one.
You'll notice that in almost all the chapters there is there's something from my life, except for that one. So I'm shy too. I've lost my train of thought. I do apologize.
There's something from your life?
Yes. They would have to start places. So as I spoke with women who had been involved in founding locations, almost all of them said, well, what we really wanted was a community center. But that didn't work out because it's very difficult to find funding for a community center. Just money basically got in the way, but also what we might kind of summarize as competing priorities. It just was very hard for everyone to agree on what they wanted in a shared community space. And so they ended up being businesses. I don't want to kind of get ahead of where we might take this discussion later, but, the business world is not necessarily friendly to feminism, to queer culture. Its aims are not necessarily the same as we want. And so many of these places that were businesses like feminist bookstores ended up, yes, of course, they were about selling books and magazines and music and all of the things that women there went for, but they were also community spaces. And, the women who started them, when I would ask, well, did you intend to become a place where, you would give up a good number of your shelves to folders about where meetings will happen, about referrals for doctors or lawyers. And they said no, but it became very clear that that was something that people needed. And the fact that there was a place downtown that you could go to in the day, that there was no age limit. In the US, bars, you have to be 21 to get in, and they're serious about that. And so, this was a place that didn't have those kinds of restrictions. And, having worked in one of those bookstores, I can say that they were indeed places where a lot of women who had no desire or intention to buy a book, but they didn't necessarily intend to buy a book every time they went there. Some of the other spaces, like Lesbian Land, which Ali mentioned, have become very controversial. But the original intention of the world is just the mainstream society is just so horrid.
Just summarise what Lesbian Land is.
Yes. So starting in the 1970s, there in fact is one. It's still in Scotland, still extant, but they're mostly in the US and Canada, they were a form of separatism. Women were sick of the way they were treated in mainstream society, so they went off to the country to form kind of parallel universe. They were often, women typically, as is so often the case, had very little money to acquire land. So the land was often beautiful, but extraordinarily difficult to live on. The places were always freezing or boiling, depending on the time of year. But it was cheaper to live there, so they could create separate spaces that required less money. And so they were often extremely creative places. All kinds of forms of spirituality were developed there, lots of publications, which usually they communicated with each other. They were also separate from urban lesbian feminists and urban gay culture. But they were, incredibly creative with their time. So this idea of we wanted a place where we could get together, where we could just do what we felt was necessary for the community. In many cases, they ended up finding those spaces in commercial spaces, but those commercial spaces were intended, they were designed to serve the community rather than to make a profit, which was very good because they rarely did make a profit, in fact.
We'll come back more to the experience under capitalism after we've spoken with Henry about his book. But one thing I'd say is the book that you've written is full of great stories. It's full of really important kind of research and interviews you've conducted over many years. But it's also full of joy. It's a really joyful book. And maybe the chapter that had me smiling most was the vacations chapter, because of your own background in hyper-traditional kind of, what do you call it, British working-class seaside holidays, and how you tried to transplant that onto queer holidays.
Yeah.
But could you take us through a little bit of that? Cherry Grove, the cruises, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I grew up, in a working-class, in a mining town in the Manchester area, and every year we went on vacation to Blackpool. We did, it was the Wakes Week for our town, and everybody from Mossel Common, the town where I grew up, went to Blackpool. You would see your neighbours. They were just maybe in their new clothes that they'd gotten for the holidays. But the things that we would do were very much of our culture. There were northern working class entertainments that were on the piers. People didn't judge us negatively. There were no middle class people sneering at us. It was our space, and I felt I was taken back there when I first went to Provincetown, which I should say is a very expensive place, especially now. It's become extraordinarily expensive to go there. But in the same way that I felt that parts of me that were typically shown disdain, that were typically something to be sneered at, were instead the norm in that place. And, the performers, Provincetown especially, which is really just a street, commercial street, and at night, almost every place that isn't a restaurant has some kind of performance on, and they're all queer performances. Many of them are lesbian performances, and that's just not something that you get every day. So even though I've lived, I've been, what I would say a professional lesbian for many years, and don't really feel that I need that kind of support, actually when you are in that space, or you are, I've actually never gone on a lesbian cruise, but I imagine it's the same thing, that you feel that, wow, this I'm the norm, and that is just not something that even now, and especially not in the 1970s, it's not a feeling, unfortunately, that we get to experience very often.
That's brilliant. Like I said, the book is so full of fascinating chat. There's way more to it than we have time for in this brief panel discussion. But I'd say I was reading this on the train down from Dundee a few weeks ago, and the conductor was a gay guy who I vaguely know, and he's like, "Oh, what's that you're reading?" And I said, and he's like, and I was telling him, I was reading the Lesbian Vacations chapter, and he says, "Oh, all my lesbian pals, they all went to Greenham Common," which you cover. And it was like sort of camping in the mud as a lesbian holiday. And he was like, "Yeah, they all offered massages for stressed out protesters." I was like, "Well, is that right?" Anyway, but there's so much that comes from it. It's a really joyful book, and we'll come back to discuss the difficulties of kind of queer culture under capitalism a little bit later. But we'll move on to Tommy Curry, Professor Curry properly, and your absolutely fascinating book, The Man Not. Now, I refer to Professor Curry because this is an academic work, and there's a lot of detail in it. There's a lot of challenging existing theories, and I had a real good run at it. It's very complex. Like, it's heavyweight, and it is like, I've only got the brain I've got. But I'd love just to read a little bit from the introduction, because I love, like, academic texts absolutely have but they can often be quite dry. They can often be quite dispassionate and objective. But this is a selected quote from the introduction. "They shame me when I speak about black men and boys. My words will not outpace the bullet of another gun, transforming flesh into rotting meat. This America makes corpses of black males." It's not conventional academic language. Can you introduce us to what you are arguing at the book and what you saw that needed corrected within the academy?
Yes. Well, first, thank you for that. That's kind of the most poetic piece of the book. In the United States, I think it's very difficult to communicate how black Americans are still dehumanized. The amount of violence, the amount of suffering that black Americans go through on a daily basis is something that I don't think resonates purely throughout Europe and the UK. We tend to focus on the spectacular acts of racial violence, where we see someone like George Floyd being killed, and that resonates as a certain kind of injustice. But in the United States, seeing black men and boys get shot, seeing black men and boys bleed out on public streets, these are normalized images. They're shared and sneered at, and people make jokes about them. Lynching and killing black men is still very much part of American culture. And I think that anyone that's seen the recent election results can see that there's still a very strong current of white supremacy in the United States that masks itself as a class consciousness or need to be free from the United States government. The Man Not intervenes on a lot of different levels, but it is a project that aims to communicate to the world how black men and boys suffer. They make up over 97% of the black people killed by police in the United States. They have the shortest life expectancy of any group in the United States. When COVID hit, they were the ones that suffered the highest rates of mortality from that disease. But when we talk about black men and boys in the public sphere, when they're discussed even in the UK news, in The Guardian, they're always presented as threats, they're presented as conservatives, they're presented as deviants and criminals and rapists. And that is an idea that has been floating around American intellectual history literally since the 1800s. The Man Not is a serious intervention and challenge, not only into academic theories such as feminism or intersectionality, but it takes a profound step forward by asking theorists to account for the world that's in front of them. When I said that my words in the book wouldn't outpace the next bullet, by that I mean is that academics often live in a world where they think what they say can change the way that everyone thinks simply because they put pen to pad. And what I was trying to communicate in this book is that no matter how much truth, no matter how many facts that I present to show that our ideologies are fraught with error, are just bias and bigotry, people will not change their minds. So I wrote the book as a way to intervene into the way that contemporary theories of gender, contemporary theories of masculinity still hold the very same views of black men as being savage, violent, and sexually predatory as slave owners did in the 1800s. So I start off with what some people take to be controversial, which is the racist history of feminism. So in the United States and the UK, feminism was not simply an argument about equality. It was an argument about taking a stance of equality next to white men, which meant the ability to rule over other groups of people as the white race did as a whole. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were very clear that their intent was not to be ruled over by lesser men. They suggest that if Anglo-Saxons are the best stock of men, what would a white woman's life look like if she was ruled over and couldn't vote against someone who was a Sambo? See, these racial logics played a great part in how white women rationalized their position under other racialized men. And people like Charlotte Gilman, who I mentioned in the text, suggested, in fact, that through evolution, white women were actually creating white patriarchs and had to stomp out parasitic males. So we get a narrative from liberalism, from our traditional stories, that suggests, no, this was an issue of all men against all women. But when you start looking at 19th century ethnology, the science of how they studied different races, you find something completely different. You see that the white race defined itself as superior in relationship to the men of lesser races. So all of the stuff that's going on in the United States and the UK in the 1830s, when they actually founded the American and London Society of Ethnology, you see that they're comparing men. And what the man Nod says is that if you start off with this hierarchy of men, saying that one group of men are civilized and intelligent and the other are primitive and savage and have to be controlled, that logic sets forth different kinds of practices and beliefs in the society that can't be easily eradicated. So the history of feminism then extends to the 20th century, where black men were actually thought to not be able to be patriarchs. They couldn't run households. They couldn't maintain families. It goes so far as to say that because they couldn't be in the home, they simply isolated themselves to the streets. So this is why they came up with why white social scientists came up with the idea that black households were run by women. But this wasn't simply a descriptive statement. It was an argument about pathology. It suggested that because black men were not like white men, all they can do is be sexually aggressive. They couldn't work or couldn't be educated, so they would use violence to compensate for what they lacked in the real world that the white race could demonstrate. And this became the basis of what we now take to be black feminism, black masculinity theory, and intersectionality. They were reading these theories, and they were saying that black men were constantly trying to find violence and usually sexual aggression as the basis of their humanity. And that's what I was trying to refute here.
There's a lot there. And I really welcome all of your questions and all your thoughts towards the end of the session. If I could just ask very quickly, there's a quote: "Black men are only discussed as perpetrators of violence in the academy and in activist spaces." This book came out in 2017?
Yes, it did.
That's a little while ago now. It's the sort of time you'd expect these ideas to start to percolate within academic circles. What has the impact been?
Well, the impact's been, as I intended. I mean, it's been splintering. All right, so we have black male studies scholars. This book really tried to launch a field, a different way of thinking about black people. And, over the last 7 years, 4 or 5 different books have come out, lots of articles. You can go on Twitter and see people arguing about these ideas constantly. So I think it's had the right kind of impact. But at the same time, I think it's also exposed that many of the things we trust, many of the stories and narratives we trust, even the field of liberal arts generally, is primarily ideological. It doesn't do well with assimilating facts about certain communities and populations. And what I think's really been exposed here is that in both American institutions and UK institutions of higher education, there's a very real importation of racism and what we call anti-black misandry. We transport theories that inculcate fear of racialized men, be they black, be they Muslim, etc., and we use academic theory to justify why we think that certain practices or activist spaces need to exclude or demonize those people on the basis of social justice.
Those are very strong thoughts, and I'm so interested and intrigued and something that all of your books did was get me to reflect on my own opinions and my own beliefs and things. And I was raised in a rural, all-white village in Scotland. And I probably did think of black men as similar to white men in occupying a similar advantage because of your maleness.
Yes.
And this helped me understand, or at least challenge, some of those perceptions around the disadvantages. Like, you write a lot, really interestingly, about black male vulnerability,
yes,
which is not a sentence I've read a lot. It's not a concept I've heard a lot in popular culture. So really, there's a lot more I want to discuss about this, and I'd love to come back when we get to a more generalised discussion with June talking about kind of racialised spaces and that 1970s, 80s feminism and the difficulties involved. But we'll just get along to Red Threads now by Henry Bell. So Red Threads is essentially the story of the kind of the red flag that we might think of the red flag as of communism, the red flag of revolution, where that emerged from, the different stories behind its emergence, and its storied journey to the present day, and the different environments in which it's been used. It's a real romp, and it takes you right across the world, and from the medieval period to 21st century. It takes you from monarchies to mutineers at sea. It takes you to Chinese state capitalist factories. Could you take us just a little bit of an introduction? Where did the red flag come from?
Yeah, I think that was kind of the original question, and I thought it was an interesting one. When I grew up around the red flag. I've lived all of my life engaged in kind of socialist and communist spaces and struggles, and so on one level, I felt like the red flag was this symbol that I knew everything about what it stood for. But as I kind of thought about it further, the idea that there's this one symbol that you find, flown by the Gazan resistance, but also it's at the Haitian Revolution. It's the flag of, Chairman Mao, but also Jeremy Corbyn. Like, how do we hold this symbol that actually so obviously is representing so many contradictory traditions? So I also was really interested in. There's a quote from Walter Benjamin that I use in the introduction that history is never safe from a victorious enemy. And I think that's kind of relevant to all three of the books in a way that the control of that narrative, the control of the stories that we tell about identities and how the kind of transmission belt of our history and memory is so often disrupted by enemies. And in kind of the triumphant period of capitalism through the 90s till 2008, you had this kind of almost obliteration of the red flag, the removal of it, from so much of civic society, certainly in this part of the world. And so I was also interested in reclaiming and challenging that and finding these connections and these ways in which that flag is still handed on in trade unionist, in workers, and in anarchist and communist communities. But yeah, so the flag itself, you're never going to find a first red flag because it's such a fundamental symbol, right? Just the first time someone raises a red piece of cloth. But probably the first time anyone does that in Scotland, anyway, that we have a record of is the Roman occupation and the use of the vexilla and this martial symbol of Roman legions. And that's the red flag that in many ways begins the journey to being the workers' flag. And the reason for that is very simple, but also involves kind of different strands. One is purely that red is the color of blood. Red is this fundamental color. It symbolizes the spilling of blood, but also of shared blood, of an affiliation, but also of an enmity. But it also is a practical thing, right? That the color red is simply the color that you see first. It has the shortest wavelength and therefore is the least disrupted. So through smoke, through cloud, through on the battlefield, you're literally more likely to see the color red. And then the third aspect it has is that red is an incredibly expensive dye to produce. So in the ancient and medieval periods, there's only a few ways to make a fixed red. One is from the Kermes beetle, which grows on oak trees around the Mediterranean. You need hundreds of these crushed up to make the color. And the other is Phoenician red, which you need more than 1 million of these sea mollusks that only occur in the eastern Mediterranean. Those are crushed and make a dye, and 1 million of those would dye the hem of a Roman toga, the kind of regal red. And it's these reds that then become the red of royalty, the red of judges, the red of popes and cardinals. And so you have red traveling through the medieval period as this kind of symbol of power, of wealth, of violence, and of the right to violence as well. So the oriflamme becomes the flag of French kings that the French fly to say that prisoners won't be taken, that they have the right to kill their enemies. All of that is happening kind of across Europe, but also is spreading in connection through the Crusades. It kind of interpollinates in the Middle East. And then something happens that the French socialist Jean Jaurès referred to as a sort of incredible historic play on words, where the flag somehow jumps and is transformed from being the symbol of the oppressor, the symbol of the monarch, the symbol of the Pope, to being the symbol of the workers. And this happens again and again in different spaces. It's not one moment, but kind of key moments of it are in the French Revolution, when Jacobins storm the throne room at the Palace of Tuileries, and they strip the red cloth from the curtains and throne, and they make flags out of it. They literally appropriate the king's materials to produce their own signal. And at the same time, on ships across the Atlantic, the red flag that all ships carried at that time to declare that they're going to attack another ship is taken up by workers on the boats to be the symbol of a strike, the symbol of a mutiny. And in fact, the word strike itself comes from this period, from the striking of rigging, when a crew were demonstrating they weren't going to sail anymore. So suddenly the flag, in all kinds of ways, is transformed and arrives in the hands of the workers for the first time. It then goes on over the 18th and 19th and 20th and 21st century to again and again be reclaimed by a new oppressed group, to move, first from the seas and from places like the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, into the factories, into a new urban proletariat who arrives almost at the same moment that the red flag arrives in the hands of the dispossessed. But it then morphs again and again. It becomes a flag of anti-colonial struggle, or a flag of the counterculture, or eventually, as you hinted, a flag of nation-states that in their way bring their own ideas of utopia and tyranny to the flag. So that, like I said, that kind of transmission of these histories and the way in which they change is what I'm really interested in. I'm also really interested in how often that's disrupted, but when we stop and limit that disruption, when we kind of find how close we are to these stories, how immediately linked we are to carriers of the red flag 30 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, and how much we're still engaged in their struggles. I feel like there's something that can really be learned in what it means to pick up that flag and keep flying it.
Thank you. I should say, so everyone in the room, as you're aware, will take questions and discussion points, but this is also being live streamed to an audience at home that can't be with us. We can also take your questions. So if you're watching this, wherever the camera is, no idea, somewhere out there, over there. If you're watching this and you'd like to take part in the discussion, just put your questions in the chat and we'll put them to the authors. I'd like to open it up now, if that's okay, and have some questions for you all just to jump into as feels fitting. So I thought I'd come back to yourself, June. You write again and again about this really interesting idea of operating queer spaces under capitalism. Something you come up with, actually, is the difficulty of transmission, because lesbians so rarely have a little lesbian to pass it on to. It's not so easy to pass on capital or space or ideology. First of all, is your book an element of you wanting to pass that on? Because so much of this sounds like wisdom from a woman hitting a certain stage.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think, a large part of my motivation was that young people that I knew, even ones who were extremely interested in queer culture, there were just large spaces in their knowledge of what had come before in their own communities just 30, 40 years ago, really not that long ago. And it's very easy to understand. Our words were limited. We, to the extent that we had any kind of, places to share ideas, and there were relatively, small circulation magazines, books that people had to, seek out. But yeah, there's a joke that probably will be of a very short distance in the book, which is about, the show Succession. If it was a a lesbian version would be like, would anybody like to take this business? Really, anybody? Anybody? It wouldn't be people fighting for it, because that is a challenge. But, there also, I should say, have been some successful handovers. I have to admit that the feminist bookstore is one of my favorite spaces, and there are some, I think at least 5 of these bookstores that have been in business since the 1950s. And they have passed on to new owners, to new blood, new energy, to younger people who have learned from the women who started these businesses, but have also changed with the times, changed with our evolving understandings of things like gender, or of just the different changes in politics. So I am is yet another thing that I'm quite optimistic about.
Good on you. I would say the book is full of great examples of trying to create a queer space that suits absolutely every queer person, but can also pay its rent.
Yes, exactly.
It's a difficult thing. Tommy, the black male under capitalism, you do reference this a few times, and if I understood it correctly, is that the concept of the black male and those masculinities emerged because they were for a time commodities themselves at the outset of capitalism. It's a very different and unique experience to anything like in my past. Could you talk to us a little bit about the black male under capitalism?
Yes. So I begin kind of narrating about black men from slavery forward. Right? And this is a very important distinction that I often think is kind of lost when we come to the UK and there's such a kind of class-conscious history, is that when you're a slave, you are the capital, you are the commodity, you're not producing products that you thereby then become alienated from in a traditional Marxist framework. So black men start off not being able to own any labor that they produce. They work themselves to death, literally, right? And in this history, you find that black men have an alienation from work. They're discriminated against. People won't hire them. One of the pieces that I mentioned in the text is how black men, in trying to find work, often had to pretend that they were women, right? This is kind of a metaphor that Baldwin's using, where black man has to put on a dress, like the case of Willie McGee, to find work. So they're excluded from the labor market and market participation. The effect of that in contemporary times is that black men are usually the most unemployed. They have this strong downward mobility that even if black men start off in the middle class, they fall to the lower classes quite quickly within a lifetime, right? So the ideas that we have about capitalism and capital accumulation and the consciousness of the middle class is something that doesn't fit very neatly on how black men both experience poverty and experience unemployment, because it's a means to manage them and keep them out of the workforce and kind of perpetuates their inability to accumulate wealth. This is one of the things that expands the wealth gap between blacks and whites in the United States. They don't get to participate in capitalism because the way that discrimination operates is it makes them an underclass. And then when you talk about something like mass incarceration, you're literally pulling them out of society, extracting their labor for free within prisons, and then making sure that when they come out, they can't mobilize into a middle class or a socially mobile sphere where they have, say, better health care access, or they're able to vote, et cetera. So one of the trends of racism in the United States is to use capitalism and the barring of black men from the job force to create an undercast, so to speak, so they can't participate in American life more generally.
No, of course. I think if I remember this correctly, one of the statistics that shocked me, I think, is it black people make up something like 10% of the modern American population?
Yeah, they're close to 13%.
13%, but black men make up 45% of prisoners in solitary confinement?
Yes.
It's really like, what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about black men, I mean, you have roughly 44 million black people in the United States. You have about 12 million adults, and you have almost 1 million black men in prison or in relationship to the mass incarceration system. So you're dealing with upwards of 900,000 to 1 million plus, depending. There was a New York Times article a few years ago that says 1.5 black men are missing between the ages of, I believe it was 20 and 44. Right? This is what I mean when I say this is a population that's targeted for either extermination or removal from the society. Like when you look at the demographic data, you can't see this as a viably healthy population that's, there's certainly diversity. That doesn't mean that every black man is poor or uneducated, but it means that as a group, there's forces within the society that's going to target them so that they don't have the same outcomes as the general population.
Thank you for that. So, Henry, the red flag of it, is it fair to say it opposes capitalism, broadly speaking? Like, in my conception of it, in Scottish kind of trade unionism, working class cultures, it would be that. What is the place of the red flag under capitalism, and does it have power to help us in this moment?
Fundamentally, that is it. It's the flag that opposes the propertied class in whatever form. Whether that's in our current society under capitalism, then it's the anti-capitalist flag. It's also been the flag that resisted feudalism. It's also been the flag of slave uprisings in Jamaica and Barbados. So it's almost Chomsky defines it as a demand for radical social change. So whatever the stated order is, the red flag becomes the symbol of the emergency and the challenge against that order. And I think, absolutely. For me, I think it offers a way forward and a way to reimagine a space outside of that. I think in some ways, if we're talking about like the production of queer spaces under capitalism, or the role of black men as not just a labor reserve army, but even a form of disciplining other workers through, for instance, prison labor. It makes me think of Fred Hampton saying, we're not going to fight capitalism with black capitalism because you don't fight fire with fire. We're going to fight capitalism with solidarity. We're going to fight racism with revolution. That possibility that the red flag can open up, that there's a whole nother history and a whole nother world that's things held in common and kind of rejects these systems of oppression, is I think something it's for.
Well, has the red flag, in your experience, has the red flag been used by kind of in queer spaces, by lesbian communities? I know you talk a lot about some of these spaces kind of being by middle-class white women. Would they rally to the red flag in the same way?
No. I mean, I think, certainly in my experience of the States, where I lived for 40 years, clearly there are socialists, there are communists, there are people who would respond to the red flag. Leslie Feinberg, who wrote Stone Butch Blues, one of the most important queer books of the last some years, was very involved in the Workers' Revolutionary Party, as was Minnie Bruce Pratt. It's not that there's no connection whatsoever, but I think this feminist work, this creation of feminist spaces was the revolution, was the feminist revolution, and I don't, it's funny. I don't think that we are a group of people who responds to flags, but you do see an awful lot of rainbow flags these days, so maybe that's the exception.
Thank you. And for yourself, Tommy, what role has, I suppose, the red flag as a symbol had for black men in the United States?
Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciated some of the historiography you were doing there. I mean, all the way back to the Haitian Revolution, the broad-based support of socialism and communism among black intellectuals, Hubert Harrison, W.E.B. Du Bois, et cetera. Black men have had a very real class consciousness, I think, precisely because of the issue that they've had with labor and employment and colonialism. So it's played a role in the intellectual development of black radicalism and black revolutionary thought. I think what's really important to point out, though, is in the way that we conceptualize socialism and communism today, we think of these as primarily leftist class analyses. When black intellectuals were thinking about communism, they were thinking about it in relationship to what were the cultural products of Africa and the African diaspora, because many African societies were coming from stateless societies. They don't have the same political economy that Marx was trying to diagnose when he was thinking about socialism in the European context. And that's a really important point, because when you think about what would be the consciousness or the cultural shift of a revolutionary thinker, that means that you have black intellectuals, the Claudia Jones of the world, et cetera, that are thinking in relationship not only to labor participation, but how black people are building self-determination and freedom against a system that's driven and enriched not only by plantation economies like slavery, but by the exploitation of black workers. And that was something that white workers and white communist thinkers could not necessarily accept on the basis of how black people were trying to uproot whole economic systems and the society itself.
That's really interesting, thank you. We'll get to audience questions in just a little minute. I'd like to round off something based on something you just said there. A lot of academic history is based around the political history of the nation state. Like, that would have been its core, that's where it grew out of, kind of giving each nation state a reason to exist. Here's all our documents, look how real we are. Nation does not play a massive role in any of your books, I would say. It's not the primary driver of much of what you're talking about. You're all arrivals to Scotland at different times across the eras. I'd love to know, in fact, you're sitting in arrival here longest. You're sitting in a sort of like the rings of a tree. I'd love to just go through and ask about how your subjects have been informed by your time in Scotland. If we could start just with yourself. The red flag in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, kind of the position of the red flag. Like, if anyone could find a way to fund me writing a book that was called "How the Communists Invented Scotland," I would love to do it.
How much do you need? We can do a whip round.
I'll do a whip round, because I think there's this fascinating way in which the ideas of Scottish nationhood and the rejection of the kind of Britishness, the broad accepted North Britain identity of the 19th century, really comes from a radical tradition in the early 20th century, and it's not just the cultural fact of that, like figures like Hugh McDermid and Edwin Morgan who create that and come from that socialist and communist background, and you know, Hugh McDermid wrote lots about the red flag, but it's also like a literal political identity that, you know, Mick Magahey's ashes are in the foundations of the Parliament at Holyrood. Jimmy Reid is this kind of seismic figure in understanding how the Scottish working class moved towards an idea of self-government as a broad mainstream thing. So there's all these ways that the red flag is kind of tied up in the creation of Scotland, but at the same time, that can often seem like a kind of a thing of the past, like people, you know, the radical rising of 1820 or Red Clydeside or even the Upper Clyde shipworkers. These are all red flag moments. But maybe now it's hard to see where that fits in. And I think my experience of the independence referendum and of organising with the Radical Independence campaign really affirmed to me that isn't a thing of the past. That actually the mobilisation that was possible, the getting, you know, 3,000 people out to conferences on a radical Scottish future, the literal like just door knocking in schemes of Glasgow, and the amount that people wanted to talk about nation in terms of class and in terms of understanding that, it feels central. But at the same time, it's you know, piled into all kinds of much more proud problem. You know, the kind of it was nae us view of colonialism and Scottish nationalism as an ability to excuse ourselves from our role in empire, our role in white supremacy, our role in, you know, Scottish capitalism and Scottish imperialism as these world forces against the red flag.
Yeah, I'll just take a pause to really humiliate whoever's phone that was. No. Very briefly, so we can get to audience questions, but if you could just summarise, like, the black male experience, how has that been informed by your time in Scotland?
Well, I mean, I think traveling to the UK and throughout Europe certainly expanded some of the views you have coming from the United States. But my journey here to Scotland was really formulated on the basis of political repression in the U.S. Because when I was working at Texas A&M, I received death threats, and it was a big blow up. Because I said that black people had the right of self-defense, which is a constitutional right in America. But white vigilantes, black cops were killing black people, so I did a podcast where I explained that black people should defend themselves from these acts of racial violence and terror. So Scotland, for me, just historically, has represented kind of an acceptance, at least, of radical black ideas, like from Douglas to James McCoon Smith, et cetera. But when I arrived here, I saw there's kind of this at-large denial of the history that colonialism, empire, white supremacy, and racism have. And that's ironic, given that I'm a professor at the University of Edinburgh, which was one of the first universities that started studying racial inferiority, racial contact with different people. It just so happens that ethnology is one of my areas of academic interest, and I landed at the university that kind of birthed ethnology for the UK. So I think Scotland has kind of opened my eyes a little bit to some of the nuances that we have about blackness, both in Europe and on the other side of the Atlantic, that deserves more comparative study. But I think that it's also a society that's mired in denial, right? It takes the exception that they're not British as the basis of saying that the culture is tolerant and non-racist, when you're looking at the data and when you're actually looking at how race is handled in this country, it's still there, it's still insidiously deep, and has very real structural outcomes in things like life expectancy, housing, and even the ability to govern, right, within the society.
No, of course. It would be class, obviously, to go independent and get a totally clean slate. And so I'm quite keen on that. But I'm really glad that you're embedded in one of our institutions as a professor.
Yeah, thank you.
And you're getting to produce these really thought-provoking works from a place like Edinburgh, where these ideas should be coming from, radical ideas should find a home. Very quickly, June, favourite queer space since you've arrived in Scotland in 2022? Except Lighthouse Books, obviously.
Yes, I think actually it really. I mean, I feel like I'm like a stuck record, but bookstores really always are my happy place, and I do. I think actually, to use Lighthouse as an example, it is a great kind of demonstration of the differences between the US and the UK. I mean, traditionally, although there were, of course, feminist bookstores especially in London, Silver Moon, Sister Right. But there was more of a tradition of the radical bookstore that were in the U.S. There may be siloed, the communist bookstore, the socialist bookstore, the black bookstore, the feminist bookstore. In Britain, they tended to be, places like Grassroots in Manchester, Mushroom in Nottingham. They were radical bookstores, and I think that there is kind of more interaction between these different communities in Scotland. Also, it's both a smaller place in some ways, and also, there are those empty spaces. So, as I said, there is a piece of lesbian land. I fear that it is a trans-exclusionary piece of lesbian land, which I don't feel good about. But, it is the only one in Britain that I'm aware of, and that feels somehow relevant too.
Well, speaking of de-siloing conversations, thank you so much to our three panellists just now. A big round of applause to all three of them. And we'll now take questions from the audience here in the room and the audience online. I will relinquish my microphone, and so hands up who'd like to ask something.
Over your books.
Oh, sorry.
There we go. Hi. Thank you so much for everyone who spoke. That was really interesting. I have a question for Professor Curry.
Yes.
I was wondering, in the case of the theorist Saidiya Hartman, she talks about how in the absence of archival presence of black people, especially in the 19th century or 18th century, where the only real records you're getting of black existence in the US is through slave ledgers and things like that. I was wondering what kind of archival barriers you encountered in your work or in your research, and how you overcame those.
Oh, well, thank you for that question. You're always limited to the archive. I'm more of an empiricist, I think, than Hartman. So I really try to reconstruct ideas. And there are incredible limitations. So one of the things, for example, when we study the rape of black men during slavery, there are very few records. You see court cases, you see testimonies, you find some evidence in Grimke when he's writing about this, about white women raping black men, about white men raping black men. But they're very sparse, so you have to reconstruct that. And that's arguably what happens. You take those kinds of fragments and bits and pieces, and you start looking for other things throughout archives, stories, biographies that try to give you that. One of the largest problems, however, when you're looking at the 20th century, is just the sheer amount of denial that gets written over a source, for example. So when you study something like black male vulnerability and you're looking for the data on black men who are, say, victims of intimate partner homicide or intimate partner violence, you'll find them in government reports, but you don't find them taken up by any kind of social organizations. So when you look at things like rape or made to penetrate violence or domestic violence, you find lots of feminist sources that'll talk about women but deny it for black men. So a large part of the work that I do with those kinds of gaps in the literature is to really reconstruct what we know the data points are, and then looking for kind of the exceptional writing or article or argument where people talk about that. And usually white social science is really good because they were trying to prove that black people were inferior. So we use data points like that No, honestly, it's crazy. But they'll use data points like black boys were raped between the ages of 9 and 14, like Ovese and Cardinier, to talk about the hypersexualization of the black culture. So you can get it, but you have to look in the most unlikely places to find when they're talking about things like boys rape or domestic violence, et cetera.
Thanks. That's a great question. Next question.
Yeah.
This is another question for Tommy, actually. One of the most inspiring speakers I ever heard was a black trade unionist in Detroit in the 1980s, talking about the Detroit Revolutionary Union movement, DRUM, in the 60s. And it was so inspiring because trade unionism is often seen as a problem in terms of race, but it was possible for black workers, of whom there were thousands upon thousands in the auto industry in the 1960s, to see trade unionism as a vehicle for black liberation as well as for socialist transformation of society. Does this play a part in your story?
It doesn't. I mean, most of my research is in kind of those fractures where traditional Marxist or liberal or feminist ideas don't work because of racism. And what you saw in the 70s and 80s is the constant reproduction of racial barriers. Some of it was certainly anti-communist, but a lot of it was also anti-black. So you didn't see the mass movements of black people and white workers come together, even though I think black people were extremely hopeful of that. You have to, intellectually speaking, you have black people that wanted to side with the white working class all the way back to the early 1900s. You had people like T. Thomas Fortune, Booker T. Washington. They understood the role that capitalism, labor, had in making sure that certain people, especially in the South, remained subservient to the people who were plant owners, factory owners, etc. But because of the idea of black inferiority, that didn't become the mass movement. That's not the history of liberation that was written in the United States. So even now, for example, you have people that give kind of a head nod to that leftist Marxist tradition. But, it's like the late Charles Mills would say, he was a Marxist that turned to liberalism because it's not like a Marxist or socialist revolution is going to happen anytime in a repressive democratic society like America that's ruled by majority whites. So I think that we can acknowledge those historical moments. We also have to be realistic about what black liberation would look like in a highly corporatist and militaristic society like the United States today.
Yes, two more.
Thank you. This can be taken by any of you because it kind of cuts across everything you were saying, but I think queer histories, colonial histories, working class history is often written out of education curriculum. We're not exposed to that growing up studying history. Do you kind of see that needing transformation, or should we be putting more energy into creating alternative spaces to learn about these histories? And what's the kind of accessibility of that for people?
Start with yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I'm really, really interested in. I'm part of a group in Glasgow that run Red Sunday Schools, which is an attempt to kind of re-establish the socialist Sunday school tradition, but also taking a lot of inspiration from Black Saturday schools that are kind of predominantly a London thing in these islands. But that idea that there needs to be a space controlled by the community out with state education to provide a counter-narrative to the racist and anti-communist versions of history that are still propagated. And I also think there's a really interesting opportunity in Scotland because the Curriculum for Excellence essentially allows teachers in Scotland to choose what they're going to teach about as long as they hit certain kind of methodological markers. And I think a lot of teachers want to teach about this stuff and they want to teach a more radical history, but the resources don't exist, or they don't necessarily feel confident in how to talk about workplace organizing or racialized histories and stuff. And so I think the more that we can be producing those resources for teachers, the more that can cut through, definitely. And then just on a kind of subnote, I also do a lot of radical history walking tours that I run with some comrades, and it's always interesting me. Anytime we do something that's an anti-colonial walk in Glasgow, it'll sell out in 12 hours because people really, really want this information and they really feel that they're denied it, I think. So yeah, totally.
That's a great answer. Do you guys have something you want to say on that, or should we get to the next question?
I can say something really briefly.
Yeah, please.
Honestly, I think that one of the problems with radicality are talking of it in these terms is that we misidentify what's radical. See, in the UK context, I hear lots of people take terms in the United States that are highly contested, like the idea of intersectionality, for instance, that suggests that we could work in multiracial and multicultural coalitions. But if you're in a society that's predominantly white, there's no evidence that those coalitions work. I've seen lots of people take radicality to be progressive ideas from the United States that have really had a certain class effect among the people who aspire to middle classes and elitism, right? So we need to be careful about what we actually think is addressing the concrete problems we think are problems in the society. If you want to solve racism, you may want to think about other radical traditions just besides what you're comfortable with, which would be intersectional feminism or Marxism, et cetera. You have to really push yourself to dig into the histories of people that you don't really hear about or may not fully consider human yet. And I don't think we do a very good job with that.
Great answer, thank you. Another question. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. So you all talked a lot about the importance of recording these histories that speaks to a need for different types of liberation, so queer liberation, black male liberation, class liberation. So my question is, in a time where I think people find it hard to get out of the listening and learning phase of educating ourselves, what advice do you have for people on shifting from reading about communities to actually being out in communities?
Yeah. One of the things that I have been really been made happy by, let's just say, is in the response to my book is young people asking, how they can form intergenerational groups, how they can learn from people who have been in the struggle for many years. And I do see that becoming more of a thing, especially, I would say, in the queer community, because much of it is based on relationships, attraction. We tend to be quite in zones of age. We don't necessarily have much kind of social contact with younger people or people outside of our own age groups. And I see that happening more and more, and that being considered more important, and very intentionally so that people can learn from each other. And I find that very, very hopeful and very positive.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. I'd love to take one or two quick questions. Do we have any online, I should say? Are we okay?
I have checked, but is there a burning one?
One more
here?
In the room? Got time for one more in the room? Was there one over there?
There's one there and there.
That's very nice.
Did you bid on a very expensive item in an auction that would?
Well, if there's no final questions in the room, is there anything online?
No, just nice comments online, but not questions. So it's just mostly thank you and very interesting.
Then, guys, I will ask you to round this up with a lovely round of applause for all three of our authors, for June, for Henry, for Tommy. They'll be signing books down by the till there. Get yourself a signed copy. Get yourself a copy of all three books. The ideal gift for the radical person in... I've just said radical and I feel bad.
No, it's not good.
The ideal book for anyone in your life for the Christmas season. Thanks. I've been Ali. Thank you so much for your interesting questions and enjoy the rest of the fest.
Thank you.